September 1944. A quiet division headquarters near Thionville, France. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel, but the mood is sour. A decorated infantry platoon, their uniforms still stained with the dust of 3 successful combat engagements, stands in a ragged line. They are not waiting for ammunition or orders to advance. They are holding heavy iron shovels. A staff officer marches past them, checking a clipboard, his eyes sliding over the men as if they were nothing more than machinery to be reassigned. The combat veterans are being moved to the rear, replaced by a fresh unit that has never heard a shot fired in anger. It is a calculated erasure of merit, buried under a bureaucratic stamp. The men do not know it yet, but a silent storm is gathering, and the reckoning for this hollow decision is already on its way. This is the story of how a battlefield commander faced the cost of a system that sorted men by skin instead of skill. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences. Sergeant First Class Curtis Lane, 32, hailed from Birmingham, Alabama. He was a man defined by the quiet gravity of command and a steadfast devotion to the 38 men under his charge. Before the war, he had worked the iron foundries in the sweltering heat of the South, a life that taught him the value of tempered steel and the weight of responsibility. He had enlisted to prove his worth, and in the crucible of 3 intense combat engagements, he had done exactly that. Lane had guided his platoon through thick woods and overexposed ridges without losing a single soul to enemy fire, earning them the highest efficiency rating in the entire battalion. He lived for his men, and he had been holding a shovel in his calloused hands when the order came to abandon the line for the latrines. Colonel Wesley Drummond, 47, was a division personnel officer born into a long line of Kansas administrators. He viewed the Army not as a battlefield force, but as an extension of the rigid social structures he had known his entire life. To Drummond, rank and race were the only metrics that truly mattered. He walked with a stiff, unnatural gait, his uniform always pressed to a razor-sharp edge, and he wore his polished shoes like a shield against the grime of the front. He believed that certain men were born to fight, and others were only fit for labor, a philosophy he enforced with a flick of his fountain pen. He had systematically reclassified 7 black combat units as service troops in just 3 months, masquerading his prejudice behind the cold, clean language of administrative rotation and personnel management. By September 1944, the Allied advance across France had slowed to a grueling crawl. The rapid momentum that followed the breakout from Normandy had collided with the harsh realities of a supply chain stretched to the breaking point and a German defensive line solidifying along the Siegfried Line. As the Third Army pushed toward the border, every rifleman, every driver, and every engineer became a critical asset in a war of attrition. There was no room for inefficiency in a theater where the lack of a single truckload of ammunition or a platoon of infantry could stall an entire armored column. This environment created a dangerous paradox. While the front lines demanded absolute reliance on performance and skill to maintain forward progress, rear area administrative offices remained governed by old, deep-seated prejudices. In the chaos of occupation and the constant pressure to fill casualty gaps, officers with institutional power could manipulate the movement of troops under the guise of necessity. Many leaders chose to look the other way, accepting these administrative shifts, without question, to avoid disrupting the bureaucracy or challenging the established order. This systemic failure allowed men like Drummond to treat the lives and contributions of combat veterans as interchangeable parts on a ledger, indifferent to the cost of replacing proven, seasoned soldiers with untested green replacements. The pressure of the advance made the administrative machinery move faster, and as the command structure struggled to keep pace, the rot in the personnel files deepened, unseen by those who were solely focused on the map. The division was moving forward, but the files were pulling the best men backward. Captain Elias Thorne of the 23rd Infantry Regiment walked into the personnel office, his face tight. He placed a requisition order on the desk and waited. Colonel Drummond did not look up. He kept his pen moving across a stack of forms, his movements precise and cold. Captain, the replacements are already assigned. These men are combat veterans, Colonel. They have 3 successful engagements behind them. The reassignment is administrative. The matter is closed. My platoon has the highest efficiency rating in the entire battalion. You are sending them to dig latrines and moving in a raw platoon that has never fired a rifle in combat. Efficiency is one thing. Captain Logistics is quite another. Negro troops are simply better suited to the labor of the rear depots. It is the most efficient use of resources. That is not a logistical decision. It is a prejudice. These men earned their place on the front line with their blood. Do not presume to lecture me on military necessity, Captain. My job is to manage the unit structure for the best interests of this division. I decide who serves where. I have an obligation to my men and to the combat capability of this unit. I cannot accept these replacements. You will accept them, or you will be relieved of your command for insubordination. Now, leave my office. Captain Thorne stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched, before turning on his heel. He walked out of the tent and toward the battalion command post, his hand shaking slightly as he pulled a notebook from his pocket. The report reached Patton within the hour. The heavy roar of a Willys Jeep engine cut through the tension in the headquarters. It rolled to a stop, kicking up a fine spray of French dust. General George S. Patton stepped out. His uniform was immaculate, 4 stars gleaming on his helmet liner, his signature ivory-handled revolvers resting heavy at his hips. He moved into the room without a sound, his eyes scanning the space, the atmosphere instantly shifting from stifling bureaucracy to absolute, focused authority. Everyone stood rigid. The air felt thin. Patton walked to the center of the room and stopped directly in front of Colonel Drummond. He did not ask for a report. He looked at the paperwork on the desk, then at the map on the wall. He turned to Drummond. You seem to have a talent for bookkeeping, Colonel. How many units have you rotated out of combat this month? 7, sir. All of them black units. And how many of them had a high efficiency rating, like Sergeant Platoon? All 7 of them, sir. And how many casualties did the replacements suffer in their first hour? 11, sir. Patton's voice was quiet, but it carried. He began to pace. He spoke of the nature of the soldier, the weight of the rifle, and the absolute equality required in the face of death. He stripped away the administrative language, exposing the cowardice of a man who moved soldiers based on skin color rather than the hard truth of their performance. He told the room that a bullet does not ask who pulled the trigger, nor does it ask who is standing in its path. He looked at Drummond. You decided to play a game with the lives of men who had proven their worth a dozen times over. You treated my finest infantry as if they were a labor detail, and in doing so, you traded blood for ink. You have a choice. You can either personally walk into that depot, apologize to Sergeant Lane, and see those men back to the front line within the hour, or you can trade your desk for a shovel and dig latrines until the war ends. Decide now. Drummond stood silent, his face pale, before he finally nodded, unable to meet the general's gaze. Drummond moved quickly to carry out the general's order. He walked to the rear area depot, his face drained of color as he approached the platoon sergeant. Under the heavy, judging eyes of his own junior officers, he stood before Curtis Lane and his men. The air in the depot was thick with the smell of waste and the suffocating reality of the work Drummond had forced upon these soldiers. As the platoon listened in total silence, Drummond was made to explain, word by halting word, exactly why they had been removed from the front and the failure of the administrative code he had used to mask it. The surrounding officers shifted uncomfortably, hearing the truth laid bare in the open. The men of Lane's platoon did not cheer. They simply watched with cold, hard stares as Drummond finished his humiliation. Within the hour, the shovels were dropped in the dirt. The platoon gathered their gear, their movements efficient and sharp. They left the latrines behind, moving back toward the sound of the front line where they belonged. The lesson was clear, public, and etched into every man who witnessed it. Sergeant First Class Curtis Lane returned to the front with a renewed sense of purpose, leading his men through the final, brutal months of the war in Europe. He survived the crossing of the Rhine and the push into the heart of Germany, eventually returning home to Birmingham in 1946. He lived a long, quiet life, passing away in 1984, always remembered by his family as a man who demanded the best from others, because he never gave anything less than his absolute best himself. Colonel Wesley Drummond faced a swift end to his administrative career. He spent the remainder of the war in the labor coordination role he had deemed fit for others, enduring the same physical exhaustion and lack of status he had once enforced. After the armistice, he served a brief term in a military prison for his systematic abuse of personnel records before being discharged in 1947. He retired to a small town in Kansas, where he lived in relative obscurity and bitterness until his death in 1972, forever haunted by the memory of the day his desk was taken away. General George S. Patton never spoke of the incident in his public memoirs or official briefings. He viewed the correction as a matter of simple, necessary discipline, a removal of rot that would have otherwise compromised the integrity of his command. He kept the report of the incident in his desk drawer, later mentioning it only once in a private letter to his wife. He wrote that the Army was a machine, and a machine that discarded its best parts was already broken. Some historians have argued that administrative reshuffling was a necessary, if cold, reality of managing a massive, fast-moving force like the Third Army, where the primary objective was the constant maintenance of forward momentum. Others have argued that such actions were an inexcusable betrayal of the meritocratic standards required to sustain morale and combat effectiveness among troops who had already proven their worth. What is certain is that the immediate return of Sergeant Lane's platoon to combat duty resulted in a significant stabilization of that sector's front, demonstrating the undeniable value of experienced, battle-tested soldiers regardless of who they were. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply signed the paperwork and looked away? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when prejudice met consequences, make sure to subscribe.